So welcome everyone. Apologies for the tech issues. My name's Lisa Mead. I'm with the Earth Law Alliance, and I'm introducing this webinar where we're going to talk about the law of ecocide. And I have with me three illustrious speakers. That's Rachelle Adam, Jonas Roupé, and Jojo Mehta. Before we start, I'm just going to hand over to Fidan to say a few words about consensus law and about the magazine and what they are doing with that. So over to you, Fidan.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Lisa, so much. I once again want to thank everybody who's here. As Consensus Law Magazine, we are really appreciate your attendance here, as you're doing great, I would say, social responsibility at this field of law, and teaching us how it's important for our rights and obligations. Once again, sorry for the technical issues we're solving right now. I want to thank Jonas, Rachelle, Jojo once again. We can start it, and there is a recording going on. Please just consider it. We can start.
Okay, so first to Rachelle, who's going to look more at the kind of academic side of this emerging area of law. And just to say a few words about Rachelle. So she started out, hello?
Meanwhile, maybe Fida she arrange the share screen, because I just want to save time. Right now, I can't share screen.
Yes,
okay.
Right now.
Rachelle started out as a government lawyer, as I understand it, then moved to become more of an advocacy lawyer. She spearheaded a petition called the Gazelle petition, in which Israel's endangered gazelle appeared as a petitioner together with 5 of its human neighbors, and they won a 2008 court decision that threw out government development plans for the habitat of the gazelle. She has a doctorate in international biodiversity law, and she is teaching at the Hebrew University of in Jerusalem, I believe, and she teaches ecological law, earth law, and that includes a course on ecocide. So over to you. Oh, and she's also working or on the board of the Earth Law Center. So over to you, Rachelle.
Okay, well, thank you, Fida and Lisa and Consensus Law Magazine for inviting me to come. I'm very happy to always, it's not a happy thing to talk about ecocide, but it's a fascinating thing. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you, I teach an environmental law course that has developed over the years into an earth law course or ecological course. All right, it's okay. Just because I realized that traditional environmental law is not working. So it's become more of a critique of environmental law, and I'm going to change the name of the course, if the faculty lets me, next year to ecological law. So we're going to be talking about ecocide, and as I said, I do teach ecocide, so I'm going to, considering that I assume that most of the audience is students, so I'm going to move ahead. This is what I teach my own students. So arguments for having an international code of ecocide, of course, because of what we see around us, massive ecological devastation, and governments and corporations, industries just don't seem to give a hoot. They just keep on making it worse. And law, apparently current laws, just feed into it. They give a legal stamp of approval, government approval for environmental devastation. And today, international environmental law, it's not criminal, it's civil law. National law can be criminal law. There's a lot of national criminal environmental law, but not international. And drawing on ecocide, in order to confront in drawing on genocide, because ecocide draws a lot on genocide, it requires collective action which supports intervening in national sovereignty issues, because the principle of international law is national sovereignty, stay away. Once, I forgot which professor, I think it was Professor Christopher Stone, that a country could like do whatever it wants with its own, it could chew up its own biodiversity and spit it out and nobody would really care. But of course, that was the same for humans, that countries could do whatever they wanted with their own populations. And the rest, other countries couldn't interfere. But of course, that changed after World War II. So starting with ecocide, I'm going to start with the consensus definition of ecocide, because how do you define it? So Stop Ecocide, the Stop Ecocide Foundation, and got together a group, what's called the Independent Expert Panel for Legal Definition of Ecocide, which is a group of leading international jurists. And they came up with the following decision. So for the purposes of this statute, ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by these acts. So dividing it up, ecocide, it's unlawful, it has to be illegal. And if it's not illegal, it's wanton, which means egregiously reckless. And it has to be committed with knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe, together with widespread or long-term damage to the environment following the acts. So the committee went on to define wanton, severe, widespread, long-term environment. I only have 15 minutes, so I'm not going to get into that, but I'm sure we'll keep, if we have to get back to it, I'll be happy to go into it. So I found this really fascinating. There was an interview with Philippe Sands, who was the chairman of the expert committee. And he doesn't come out saying that ecocide is going to save the world and it's going to save all our problems. He said it's similar to like prosecuting crimes against humanity and genocide. And that hasn't ended torture or mass murder. We still have torture and mass murder despite multiple numbers of international conventions against genocide and against and for human rights. But what those crimes did was they changed human consciousness. They basically said that this is not an acceptable form of behavior. And I think that's the proper way to think about the crime of ecocide, that we're trying to change human behavior by moral, I would say, moral anguish or moral despair or desperation at what is going on today. So examples of ecocide. So when I think of ecocide, the first one that comes to my mind is always the tar sands in Alberta, which is an area of massive oil production. It's bigger than the entire area of England, and it's one of the biggest industrial projects on the planet. And I've heard that you can even see it from outer space. Like, it's such a huge area. And it's definitely a reckless violation of rights of nature and human rights. Because I'm from Earth Law Center, I deal a lot with rights of nature, and I'm going to be talking about that too. And another example that maybe is less familiar is mountaintop removal, which is coal mining in the United States in Appalachia, which of course is one of the poorest areas in the United States. And it causes massive land and water pollution. It makes people very sick, terrible contamination. And my question is regarding each example, is this an example of ecocide? And of course, ecocide in Malaysia, Indonesia for palm oil and wood production. The palm oil, which is totally ubiquitous today. I mean, any product you take off the shelf in the supermarket, I would say 7 out of 10 of them have palm oil in them. Massive destruction of forests in Malaysia, Indonesia, primarily other countries as well. And of course, deep sea mining, which could be the next ecocide of the marine environment if we don't stop it. So the question that I'm raising with this new definition, and with this new definition of ecocide that the committee put together, would the Canadian tar sands catastrophe be considered ecocide? Would it meet the consensus definition? And the first question is it legal? So we have to remember that the tar sand is happening, this catastrophic production of oil is happening in Canada, one of the wealthiest Western countries, whose prime minister is always talking about his commitment to the environment, that prides itself on taking care of their own environment and the global environment. But on the other hand, I mean, the tar sands, what they're doing there is legal. It's under permit of the Alberta provincial government. I know that it's subsidized. I don't know what exactly the role of the national government is, if there are any Canadians, or maybe they can help me out. But you could not say that it's illegal. So already that would be a problem defining the Canadian tar sands under the new definition as ecocide. So the question is it wanton? Well, it's definitely wanton. But on the other hand, if it's legal, how does it balance out? So I'm just raising these questions because to me, this is the most interesting part of ecocide in the new definition, to see how it works out in reality, because we have so many cases of environmental devastation. It's worthwhile perhaps testing them and seeing if it works or doesn't. So regarding the tar sands, was the devastation committed knowingly? So it's hard to say that they don't know about. I mean, they're not doing it to tear up the forest, but they obviously know that that's what's going to happen. So is it knowingly or not knowingly? And going from the Canadian tar sands to the Amazonian rainforests, is it legal? Did the Brazilian government under Bolsonaro give them permits? Did they do it knowingly? And the mountaintop removal in the US, that's under permits of I think of the EPA. And Trump rolled back a lot of regulations that made it harder to do mountaintop removal. But this terrible, they're doing like slicing off tops of mountains to get to more fossil fuel inside. It's legal. So we have to take that into consideration with this new definition. And I would love to hear, other people's feedback on this too. So the first terrible case of ecocide was the United States that sprayed the jungles of Vietnam with Agent Orange. And that was to kind of fish out the guerrillas, the Vietnam fighters, the North Vietnamese. But not just that, they wanted to destroy the economy because they targeted farms, they targeted water sources. It was to hurt the population as well. So within a decade, from 1961 to 1971, the US Air Force sprayed about 20 million gallons of this compound of chemicals on Vietnamese forest farms, water sources, on an area the size of Massachusetts. And again, it was to to defoliate the forest, to make the trees, the leaves fall off, and to destroy the agriculture. So it's also against humanity as well. Now, Agent Orange was developed by Monsanto. And Monsanto, I think today is owned by Bayer in Switzerland. And it contains dioxin, which is one of the meanest, nastiest chemicals that there are, that lingers forever in the environment and makes people, other species, and ecosystems very, very sick. So in June 1972, at the Stockholm Conference, there was a terrible, all over the world, people were furious at the United States. It was a terrible anti-US feeling around the world, primarily because of these terrible acts of environmental and human devastation in Vietnam. So Prime Minister of Sweden, who apparently was really an amazing, he seemed to have been an absolutely amazing person. He was very tragically assassinated several years, I think maybe about 10 years after the conference. So in his opening speech to this conference. And the 1972 conference, it was a huge conference. It was the first of the environmental mega conferences. After that, there was the 1992 one. And now we have them. I think we stopped having them. I think people are just kind of like disappointed that nothing's coming out of them. But once they had them, and they were considered huge deals, and this was the biggest one. And look what he says. He says, the immense destruction brought about by indiscriminate bombing, by large-scale use of bulldozers and herbicides is an outrage sometimes described as ecocide, which requires international attention. So he brought it up in 1972, but the ecocide had been coined before. So how do we deal with these injustices? And I'm quoting, this is a quote from this, anybody who wants to read a good history of modern ecocide, of the movement to bring about crime of ecocide, I recommend Anastasia Green's article. So how do we deal with these terrible instances of injustices? So the moral outrage that we feel when we experience them, read about them, hear about them. So she suggests that bold ideas can create new momentum and great changes can be accomplished with enough vision and drive. So the first person who really kind of caught my attention was William Wilberforce, who was a British politician, and he just couldn't bear the slavery trade. He thought, rightly so, that it was some most horrible thing that had to be in. And he worked all his life to stop it, and he penned manifests and books and articles, and he put his life work into stopping slavery in the British Empire. And he succeeded. In 1807, the slave trade was abolished, even though only in 1833 was freedom given to the slaves in the British Empire. But it was his life work. And then Raphael Lemkin, who was Polish and escaped from the Nazis, I think in 1941, and whose entire family totally determined what he was going to do with the rest of his life. So he originated the term genocide. And he was the one who crafted and initiated and helped draft the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which classified genocide as a crime under international law. And similar to Raphael Lemkin was Hirsch Lauterpacht, who was considered one of the most outstanding international jurists of all time. And he was originally from the Ukraine, and he came to study in England, and he stayed because of the war. And his family too, they were both Jewish, and his family was also totally wiped out in the Holocaust. And he dedicated his later years to crimes against humanity. He was a justice in the International Court of Justice, and he was involved in the crafting of European and international conventions of human rights. And his goal was human rights. He couldn't bear the suffering, and he worked to that end, and he created these conventions that anybody born after 1950s kind of takes them for granted as part of our legal system, but they weren't always there. And here's a quote from Philippe Sands that wrote a wonderful article about him called My Legal Hero, Hirsch Lauterpacht. Lauterpacht's writings and activities reflect that the reality that words matter, that ideas can lead to change. So words do matter. And as we know, we can change things by starting out with ideas. So Arthur Gallstone, he was one of the chemists who he worked on chemicals as part of his doctorate, and he was a chemist. And the United States government took his work on defoliants, and they took it, and on the basis of his work, they developed this terrible poison, Agent Orange. And he was so furious at what he did at what the United States government had done, developing this terrible toxin, defoliant, and then using it against people and the environment in Vietnam, that he spent the rest of his life also working for a convention to ban ecocide. So he said, after the end of World War II, and as a result of the Nuremberg trials, we justly condemn the willful destruction of an entire people, calling this crime against humanity genocide. It seems to me that the destruction of the environment ought similarly to be considered as a crime against humanity, to be designated by the term ecocide. And at the present time, the US stands alone as possibly having committed ecocide against another country, Vietnam, through its massive use of chemical defoliants and herbicides. So that was back in 1970. 1971, the US government did ban the use of Agent Orange. And of course, Polly Higgins, who triggered this campaign, what we're all working on, what people are working on now, and I mean, what I do, everything I've known about is because of her, is what her work has done, and to establish ecocide as a fifth crime under the Rome Statute, which would be under the jurisdiction of the ICC. So an international law against ecocide, again, it would be an expression of moral outrage, drawing on genocide and other crimes against humanity that really found their roots in the Nuremberg Charter and the judgments, which as a result, we have human rights law. And of course, Stop Ecocide, who is now working on amending the Rome Statute. And there are already 4 international crimes: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. And the 5th one would be ecocide. Each party has 1 vote, but the problem is, to get an amendment through, they would probably need to have the most powerful countries that are also the worst polluters. So, for example, the United States, India, China, they are not members of the Rome Statute, which means that they would not be able to bring individuals from those countries to the ICC for criminal prosecution. So there are ways of getting around it. But what about Brazil? Brazil is a member, it's a state party to the Rome Statute. And the question is, would Brazil even agree to something like that? I don't think so. Anyways, international law already recognizes wartime ecocide, not only in the Rome Statute itself, but under ENMOD, which is the 1978 Convention on the Prohibition of Military or any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques. But so it bans ecocide in wartime, but it does not ban it in what we call peacetime. And of course, there are national ecocide laws, and there's the Belgian one, which is the most recent from 2022, which just came in. And I just want to say something about ecocide and earth law. So earth law, we assume an ecological consciousness. And from if we're looking at ecocide, it assumes that you should know when your actions will cause this terrible damage to nature. And it's simply not reasonable for you to act without first thinking of how will it impact natural systems. So from an earth law viewpoint, tar sands are simply not a legitimate way to provide energy, because they do not keep the integrity of the earth and their devastating nature. Generally, fossil fuels would not be a legitimate way to provide energy. And people should not feel they are innocent and above the law when they destroy the planet. Ecocide will call them to their duty of care. And the crime of ecocide, and this is also a very good article that I just wanted to bring to your attention that talks about rights of nature and ecocide. So this is a quote: the ICC allows victims to participate in its proceedings and submit claims for reparations. Victims are defined as individuals who have suffered harms. So if ecocide were introduced, it might be able to expand this to the whole concept of victimhood to encompass other species, ecosystems. So, whoop, there you go. It could mean bringing in rights of nature. And I want to end with this, what David Suzuki, the eminent educator, ecologist who brought knowledge of the environment to so many people through his television series, the way we see the world shapes the way we treat it. If a mountain is a deity, not a pile of ore, if a forest is a sacred grove, not timber, if other species are biological kin, not resources, or if the planet is our mother, not an opportunity, then we will treat each other with greater respect. This is the challenge, to look at the world from a different perspective. Okay, so thank you. I hope I didn't go over too long.
Oh, that's great, Rachelle. Thank you so much. And welcome to those who've joined in the meantime. We'll move on because we did start a bit late. So I want to make sure we have enough time after the speakers. So there'll be 3 speakers, each speaking for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer at the end. So if people want to put their questions in the Q&A now, obviously I'll moderate that at the end and we can go through them. So I'll introduce Jonas Roupé next. Jonas has worked with business renewal and sustainability since about 1995, and he's the co-founder of End Ecocide Sweden and is the author of a recently published report entitled Ecocide Law for the Paris Agreement, and that is what he's going to talk to us about now. So over to you, Jonas.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I will do my best in getting this up. Let's see. Now you should see something. Oops, I went too far. And I have a meeting. Let's see. I need to clear the screen. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for hosting this important webinar, and with this distinguished presenters as well, that I'm also delighted to listen to. So we did a report, myself and Professor Vala Ragnarsdottir of, let's see, so I get it right. She's professor of the Institute of Earth Science at University of Iceland. She's also a distinguished fellow of the Schumacher Institute, who published this report along with End Ecocide Sweden and with funding from the Swedish Postcode Foundation. And what we set out to do is kind of a consequence analysis with the definition as it's proposed by the expert drafting panel. What would be the consequences? And I think you could, if you would like to summarize the findings in like a sentence, you could say that regardless of what other activities needed to curb climate change and adapt to climate change, ecocide law is absolutely fundamental at the base, but it won't solve climate change by itself, of course. So just like setting it in context, since industrialization, so for instance, starting at 1850, the greenhouse gases have increased, obviously, due to coal, land use, oil, gas, and cement. And the atmospheric levels would be a lot higher had it not been for the huge service done by the land sinks, which is the living systems, the ecosystems on land, and the ocean sinks, which is both the living fabric or the living ecosystems in oceans and in water, but also water in itself that is becoming more acid and starts to dissolve everything that has an exoskeleton, like shells and stuff. So those two services from the Earth have reduced CO2 in the atmosphere. And what ecocide law would do is to protect the things that protect climate. Ocean and land ecosystems would be getting a stronger protection. And also it would speed up the transition away from fossils and destructive practices by direct, but primarily through indirect means. And in order to have a chance to reach the Paris Agreement, obviously we cannot only focus on renewable energy, but we need to protect both these two, or achieve both protection of the living Earth and change our ways. And just to zoom in, and Rachel, you mentioned it, looking at the the seabed, what is happening to it in areas beyond national jurisdiction, it's been called the new Wild West. It's more or less exponential exploration, and the expert drafting panel's definition require or enables ecocide to be defined even if you cannot directly link it to direct human suffering. So it's a beautiful definition that would strengthen the systems in oceans which we depend on as a collective, in ways that they aren't protected. The protection is very weak, to be kind. And also a few words on subsidies. So subsidies is a key obstacle. That is kind of the key point here. And this diagram shows billions of tons of CO2 over the years. And the wider bluish line is the emissions consistent with 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the narrow line is the country's current plans and predictions. And what IMF, the International Monetary Fund, have calculated is that without the subsidies, we would be in line with the Paris Agreement or quickly get in line with the Paris Agreement. And that's not by reallocating the funds to renewables, but just removing them. And they also conclude that the spending gap of the Sustainable Development Goals is about the same size as what goes into fossil fuel and fossil subsidies. And what ecocide law would do would be actively support officials in shifting away from subsidies, not by putting probably so many government officials in jail, if any, because you would need to be an act of ecocide, but the immense pressure from those that stand to gain from these acts, they would be disinclined to continue, many of them. And a large part of the fossils are, and the fuel, the oil, comes like 70%, come from areas would need to be put in place, or it would need to stop in order for these executives and people that benefit from the activities, the acts, to be in safe distance from ecocide. And connected to fossil subsidies, this comes from a survey or research, I should say, on where is the benefits from the subsidies going. And it concluded that the poorest parts of the populations in developing countries get very little benefit from the subsidies, and the richest get a lot of benefit. So in order to protect the disadvantaged in developing countries, which is of huge importance, fossil subsidies as they are, is a very ineffective way to do that. And SDGs will be better, and there are many other more precise instruments that you could use, and we discuss it in the report. And it's one of the things that surprised me is the wealth of knowledge that exists in better ways for this. And renewables is a very powerful force today. They exceed expectations and have done it over and over again. Replacement is inevitable. Renewables will replace fossils, but the time is, of course, short. 80% of total global energy consumption, no, really total global energy consumption is fossils, and subsidies is actively hindering the development. And it's, of course, the same system. So if you lift away benefits on the old energy system, you speed up the new, and a lot on this, and are shifting capital. But also many insiders in the investment community says that it's impossible to shift the system without hard policy in place. It's not enough that all that wants to change shift, but those that are disinclined or have vested interests in continue to get dividends from their balance sheet that is directed to fossil production, they would need to have a harder help to shift. So in 5 points, there are many intervention points, but in 5 points, the first, perhaps most about is that the ecocide law as it's defined only targets the most serious when it comes to harm and the most wanton or already illegal acts. Where, so for instance, a big problem with environmental protection is that existing laws many times aren't followed and the legal systems are weak, and then we need a strong international law that can kick into gear when a nation needs it. It protects carbon sinks, which is essential. It's really no difference between, well, it's a difference, but it's connected, the atmosphere, what happens in the atmosphere, and what happens on the planet. So if we want to protect the atmosphere, we need to protect life on the planet as well. And it encourages the shift in financial flows in many ways towards renewable energy. It levels the international playing field. So when you have an international backbone or a safety rail for international protection, it's less easy to get a lot of money by moving production and refinement and mining to the weakest places where the population and their protection and environmental protection is the weakest. So by having that in place, the world economy and those that want to do the good, which is the majority of companies, benefit. Life becomes easier. It's kind of, we would even want to say liberating for all the green movements. And it prevents harm before it happens, which is very important when it comes to climate change. So in summary, we regard ecocide law as a very fine gift to leaders, and we think specifically on the leaders that went to COP27, because leaders, as people, want to keep their commitments, and ecocide law is needed to back the Paris Agreement. And I'll stop there and allow time for questions, comments, and objections. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonas. We'll take questions at the end if that's all right. So we'll move on to Jojo. One thing I did want to say, just thinking about climate change and ecocide, the other thing we have to be careful of is there's some of the solutions that are being discussed as possible ways to combat climate change could end up being ecocides themselves, the kinds of geoengineering ideas that are coming through. So exactly. I think, law of ecocide could also help us in that regard too, to make sure we don't have these false solutions to climate change.
Really, that's in the report, I should say. I forgot to say it's a really important point. Thank you.
Yeah. So just moving on to Jojo. Thank you for joining us, Jojo, and for your patience as well, as we've had this delay. So Jojo co-founded Stop Ecocide in 2017, which supports the establishment of ecocide as a crime at the International Criminal Court. And she's a key spokesperson now for Stop Ecocide International and has overseen quite an exponential growth in not just interest, but movement towards this actually becoming law. So I will hand over to Jojo to talk more about that.
Hi, thanks, Lisa, and for inviting me today. It's great to be here. Yeah, I think this whole initiative is rapidly becoming a global movement, actually, towards the criminalization of ecocide. And I suppose that maybe the place to start was with my dear departed colleague, Polly Higgins, who was researching in at a point in her career where she realized that she wanted to be looking at legal protection for the earth. How could we create a legal duty of care for the earth? And one of the things she discovered was that when the drafting process for the Rome Statute, in other words, the governing document of the International Criminal Court, was being discussed in the 1990s, there had originally been a clause that would have prevented or sanctioned severe long-term and widespread harm to nature. And that clause never made it to the final treaty in 1998, so that when the International Criminal Court opened its doors 20 years ago in 2002, it did so with the Rome Statute in place, covering just 3 crimes, which were genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Now later, crime of aggression, which had always intended to be there, but it took a while to define, was then added. And Polly's question, which I think really drove her for the rest of her life, was what if we actually replaced that effectively missing crime, and how indeed might the world look today had that crime been in place 20 years ago. I started working with Polly in 2014, and at the time, the idea of criminalizing the worst harms to nature was still seen as quite sort of extreme. A rather human characteristic, whereby people obviously felt that Polly was the one doing the work, and therefore perhaps they didn't need to. And I think that is often what happens with sort of movements that have a very strong figurehead. And when she was no longer there, I was approached by a lot of people, lawyers, politicians, grassroots campaigns, saying, we don't want this work to die with her. How can we help? And of course, in a way, my first reaction was, well, I'd said that before. but at the same time, what it began was a kind of what you might call a gigantic sort of dot joining exercise of bringing people together who were interested in moving this forward, and doing so at all levels. And I think what possibly began as a sort of default position of simply talking about it to whoever would listen, over time has actually become a sort of concrete strategy, in the sense that what we've discovered is that the more people are talking about this, the more politicians listen. And that is actually a cross-sector, sort of cross-cutting issue around in society. So we quite consciously now, in terms of developing global cross-sector support for an international crime of ecocide, we quite consciously approach and deal with and create, briefing situations or convenings, at all levels of society and in many different geographies as well. So, we support grassroots mobilizations around this, but we also, do briefings and events and informational situations for NGOs, interest groups, lawyers, politicians, academics, and effectively keeping it as broad as possible, because what we've realized is that politicians tend to turn up at the party when everyone else is already there having a good time. They like to feel safe. And so the more this conversation is in play in different arenas, the faster it moves in terms of the political support. And I would say that there have been some very key milestones in the last sort of year and a half, and the first and most obvious was already talked about by Rachelle Adam, which is the emergence of the consensus definition of ecocide. And that has been a really key moment, because of course there were working definitions in the past. Polly had one that we used as a campaign definition for some time, but there were others. But they had always been a lawyer or a small group of sort of allied lawyers who decided that, of course, ecocide should be a crime and it should look like this, and they would set out what they thought it should look like. I mean, the difference, I think, with this, with the emergence of the consensus definition last year, was that it came from a political appetite, in the sense that we were actually approached by Swedish politicians interested in potentially having something politically practical that they could actually put in front of the Swedish government and say, could you get behind this at the International Criminal Court? Now, the Swedish government itself has never actually taken a specific position on it, and may not do so in the immediate future, given the recent change of government. But what that request enabled us to do was to bring together top lawyers from around the world, so that we had 12 lawyers from all from different parts of the world, but also different legal disciplines, so international criminal law, public international law, environmental law, but also different ideologies. So from the quite conventional International Law Commission members, former ICC judges, to much more sort of what one might think of as sort of people's lawyers or activist jurists at the other end, people like Valerie Cabanes or Pablo Fajardo, for example. Now, what that meant in practice was that all of those lawyers had to concede something in order for that consensus to be reached. And there was also a broad public consultation engaged in at the beginning of the drafting process, as well as various expert opinions feeding in, and also an Indigenous advisory group. So in terms of what emerged from that, it had a kind of breadth of legitimacy and weight that has simply not been the case with any previous definition. And I think that the sort of proof of the pudding is in the eating, as they say over here, which is to say that over the last year and a few months, become the sort of de facto starting point for diplomatic discussions, but also for sort of legal and academic discussions. Now, not every lawyer or professor may agree with it, but it certainly creates a starting point for discussion. And of course, once we get to the stage of negotiating at the International Criminal Court, we don't know exactly what definition will end up being finally adopted. But what we do know is that the sort of balance and conciseness, if you like, of this definition has been instrumental in having the discussion in the political world move forward very fast. So where in 2019, I mean, before Vanuatu brought it up for the first time at the International Criminal Court, which they did in December 2019, before that, the discussion was simply not really live at all in the international diplomatic space. Now, there are at least 24, possibly 25 now, countries where discussion of ecocide law and criminalizing ecocide is on public record at parliamentary level or at government level, in different, to different degrees, of course. It's not to say that that all of those countries are sort of immediately saying, yes, let's legislate tomorrow, but there is, we can say that the discussion is firmly on the diplomatic table, both sort of more broadly and also specifically at the ICC. To celebrate 20 years of the ICC. And that conference focused on the past, present, and future of the court. Now, what was interesting, I mean, we sent someone along from our team in The Hague, to make sure that ecocide somehow entered the discussion. We thought maybe a question could be asked or it could be brought up in some way. And we were pleasantly surprised to find that actually a large part of the future section of that conference was actually dedicated to the possibility of ecocide becoming the fifth crime. So, that just shows sort of how seriously it is being taken at the level of the ICC. Now, of course, in the context of the ICC, it is not the court itself that decides whether the crime gets added to the statute. It is the Assembly of States Parties. It is the member states, if you like, the signatory states to the statute that decide that. And in order to do that, one needs at least 2/3 of those member states to agree, which sounds like quite a lot. I mean, there are currently 123 member states, but the discussion, as I say, is already live. There is already the beginnings of perhaps a cross-regional group of states that are interested in moving this forward. But also, I think what we also have to realize is that there's a one state, one vote sort of structure there, similar to the UN, but unlike the UN, there is no veto, there is no Security Council veto. Which means that it is simply ultimately a numbers game. But what we also know is that the ICC likes to work ideally by consensus. Of course, they'll go to a vote if they need to. But what that means is that it becomes fairly clear fairly quickly who are your allies and who are those who are least keen, because anybody in between is simply perhaps not entering the discussion. But that also means, of course, that they're potentially allowing something to move forward. So that's also quite interesting. And I think that what we can also say from, for example, I mean, we've just come back from COP27 in Egypt. And what we discovered there was that there was a huge appetite for this conversation. We probably spoke with at least 20 countries that we had not yet had conversations with and who were interested in the ecocide conversation. We've also seen support, for example, from the United Nations Environment Programme, which has effectively sort of watched this discussion float to the top, as Inger Andersen, who is the CEO of UNEP, recently said at the just after the Stockholm conference in June. And to the extent that UNEP actually provided a moderator for our official side event at COP27, which is a strong endorsement of the importance, again, of the conversation. And what we're also seeing, sort of from an advocacy perspective, is that there are various sort of groups and networks which are emerging as very supportive. And that, for example, I mean, the whole sort of youth movement globally has repeatedly now called for ecocide law as part of its demands to global leaders. And that happened in COP26 last year. It happened at the United Nations Environment Assembly. It happened at the Stockholm conference, and it happened again during Climate Week in New York, and again at COP27, as sort of key demands coming from the youth movement. So this is a really strong sort of impetus coming from the youth movement, but also from the faith voices as well. I mean, actually, Pope Francis was the first, one could argue, was the first head of state to say that ecocide should be a fifth crime at the ICC. That was back in 2019, and that was reiterated. He reiterated that just a couple of weeks ago. But also the sort of there's a growing movement, a sort of interfaith movement, if you like, behind creating a law of ecocide, simply because in the many faiths, both the text-based faiths and of course the indigenous cultures, there is a very strong affinity in different ways in those different cultures, but nonetheless a sort of unifying theme around looking after Mother Earth or whatever the individual faith defines the earth as. So that's there's a very strong alignment there, and was quite amusing in one of our events at COP27, where we had this indigenous spokesperson from Canada, actually from one of the First Nations in Canada, and the moderator was asking her, how does ecocide law kind of tie in with the sort of the laws and rules within the cultural context that you're familiar with. And what was interesting was that her assumption of how unacceptable to damage Mother Earth was so sort of basic that she almost didn't understand the question because it was so obvious. And once the moderator had asked it a couple of times, she sort of said, well, of course, rule number one is that you don't damage Mother Earth. That's it was just so much as part of her sort of DNA that it seemed sort of almost too obvious to say, which is really interesting. But perhaps, and I'll perhaps finish with this, because I realize I'm going to be overrunning my time if I don't finish soon. But what I would also say has been emerging, which has been really important as well, is an acknowledgement from the corporate world as well, because I think that often there's a sort of sense that perhaps corporations might not want this law, but actually the reverse is true, or it certainly seems to be emerging. That's the case, in the sense that we've now had 2 years in a row a really major investors network, the International Corporate Governance Network, which is made up of all the biggest financial firms in the world, has specifically asked leaders at COP27 to collaborate on criminalizing ecocide, which I think is fantastic, and in the sense that it really recognizes that the investment world is looking to see stability in the future, is actually looking for frameworks that are going to stabilize what they do with their finances. And I took part in an event at COP27 that was hosted by one of the former high-level climate champion, Gonzalo Munoz, who was one of the key people in the Race to Zero initiative. And he very clearly said that, we need to start seeing law not just as a stick, but also as a carrot, as an empowering framework, so that the direction of where things where finances flow and where innovation and strategic thinking are directed, it's really, really helpful to have these frameworks. And one of the things that we found with the definition, and it's funny, I normally have one of our cards handy so I can sort of show how concise the definition is. It fits on the back of a business card. But what we found is that when we put that definition in the hands of experts in their sector, whoever they are, they look at that and they immediately have a set of questions that emerge that are totally relevant to the industry that they're in. And that in itself is a kind of gold dust, because what we're seeing, of course, is a huge frustration globally at how, the pace of action on climate and ecological breakdown has been far too slow. And we would argue that that is potentially precisely because this framework isn't in place where people can actually relate that to their sector and say, what are the questions we need to ask? And of course, the way that the human brain works, as soon as we ask the right questions, we start finding the answers. But unless we have the right frameworks, we don't start asking the right questions. So I will leave it there for now, but obviously very much looking forward to any discussion and questions to follow. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jojo. So we have about 20 minutes left for some questions and answers, and we have a few in the chat. We also have one question raised by Rachelle earlier when she first spoke about the definition, and I would like to clarify that because it's in my mind too, in the purpose of the way I've read it. So you have on your website, Jojo, Article 8, ecocide, and it talks about ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts. So I'm understanding it to mean it could be a lawful act. So say government's given a license to do something, but it's so wantonly destructive that it therefore amounts to an ecocide. That's the intention? So something like the tar sands, it's done with the grace and license of the government of Canada, but would that then count as an ecocide because it's a huge area of destruction?
I think very specific cases, I mean, probably most lawyers wouldn't answer that directly, in the sense that it will depend on the text that's finally arrived at and what each individual case requires in terms of looking at it. I mean, just in the same way as if someone beats you up on the street, it's not the number of bruises that will tell you whether it's attempted murder or whether it's just simple assault. Yes, that's exactly the point of having the wanton aspect in there, in the sense that what you have to realize with international criminal law is that it is on the whole elevating crimes that already exist to another level. And that makes a lot of sense, therefore, to have the phrasing around already unlawful acts. And of course, one of the things we've discovered, and actually it's been popping up a lot at COP27 as well, was just the fact that a lot of ecocides, or a lot of really serious damage, is already in breach of something. It's either in breach of its own permits, or it's in breach of rights and regulatory frameworks. And so actually the unlawful probably covers more than one might initially feel reading the definition. But the wanton aspect is in a way it was what the panel were doing with that, was bringing in the environmental law aspect of sort of balancing, because most environmental law doesn't include, especially international, doesn't include outright prohibitions, but is based on a principle of sort of sustainable development. Because actually, when we come down to it, everything we do depletes the environment in some way. I mean, we simply cannot exist without that being the case. But so it's a question of balancing, and the wanton aspect effectively is saying, if what you're doing is disproportionately destructive, then it too could fall under ecocide. So, potentially in the future, a project like the tar sands could come under that kind of question mark. And I think, but I think also what we need to realize is that this is not a law that would be retroactive. That this is not about going back and punishing people who have been committing what will then become ecocide, if you see what I mean. And actually, although that may be disappointing, especially from the activist perspective, it's nonetheless actually quite important, because what we're aiming to do, and I think it's sort of not hard to sort of understand this, is the aim is not ultimately to punish, is to protect the planet. You know, it's ultimately to change behavior and to protect the living world. And what that means in terms of changing behavior is that the law needs to act as a deterrent. And that, of course, is ultimately the point of criminal law. I mean, you know, murder is a crime in order to prevent people being killed. You know, that's the whole point. So the visibility of the approach of this law, if you like, and it certainly is becoming visible in the sense of the growing momentum of it, is that people can put their strategic heads on now. They don't have to wait till the law comes into place. In fact, from a sort of corporate practice perspective, it's actually really important that there is a time lapse, hopefully not too big a one, because obviously we haven't got a lot of time, but certainly a time lapse in order to be able to shift finance and corporate practice in a new direction.
Well, that makes sense, Jojo. Thank you for elucidating. Do either of the other speakers want to add to that? It was your point. Yeah, sure, Jonas.
Yes, very quickly, or I think I saw it in your answer, Jojo, in the chat as well, that the wanton paragraph as it's designed is, I think it's beautiful because it's progressive. So things that might not be disproportionate today, 10 or 15 years ahead with technological development and better voluntary standards that we could get help to interpret what is good practice and not, it will be wanton later. So it's actively, the definition is future-proof, you could say, in that sense, that it helps us to progress, and it helps innovation and competition in the way we'd like it to do. Also an important thing.
Exactly. Thanks, Jonas. Rachelle, would you like to add anything?
Yeah. First of all, as Jojo pointed out, this is not the final definition, and I know that the European Law Institute is also working on a code to on their own definition and their own draft of an ecocide law, which they want to present to the European Parliament. So there's a long way to go, and there'll probably be, a lot of definitions. What I do want to point out is that, going back to the tar sands, it's an ongoing crime. I mean, as long as they're working there, and even after they finish working there, it'll keep on. It will be a candidate for the crime of ecocide because it hasn't stopped. It's like the what Texaco and Chevron did to the Amazonian Ecuador. I mean, they stopped, I think, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, but people are still dying there, getting cancer, and the water is it keeps on being polluted because all the oil residues that they put into the water there, it's like keeps on bubbling up. So I think that is probably a true definition of ecocide, in that, well, it's endless, and that's part of the definition, and these things don't stop. So I hopefully feel that, when ecocide does become an international crime, these corporations and governments and the individuals there will have to be accountable for what they've done to us for all these decades. So I think it's very important to keep that in consideration, that these are ongoing crimes. And I think for any definition that we do have, I think it's always might be a good exercise to run it through some case studies and see how it works. Okay, that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to go into the chat because we have Richard, who's asked a question 45 minutes ago, actually. He said, does the definition of ecocide, or could it change in the future due to the reason that the means of destruction of nature, and maybe improving is not the right word there, but like we're getting better at destroying nature. I suppose you could say a nuclear bomb, we only knew how to do that from 1945. But I think that's what you mean. Richard, do you want to elucidate what your question, or do you just want to leave it as that? I can ask him to unmute. I don't know if that will work. Richard, are you there? Yeah, he may not be there. But anyway, does that, Jojo, do you want to, no, I'm asking you to, there we go.
Yeah, I mean, I think this actually relates to what we were just talking about in terms of the future-proof nature of the definition, because it doesn't focus on a specific activity, but it focuses on the potential consequences. In other words, how much damage is considered serious and severe and widespread and long term, that should indeed respond to the sort of future development of other technologies. And obviously what we would also hope is that with this law approaching and ultimately in place, that those developments will actually go in more positive directions rather than towards more efficient ways of destroying the environment. I mean, frankly, we're all doomed if it carries on.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Anybody else want to speak on that point? No. So Saville has said, you emphasize the right of people to live in a healthy environment. However, as we know, states also have obligations such as economic development. And how do we adjust this balance? And I think some of what you said has addressed that, Jojo, but does anyone want to add anything on that, that point? I think I would just like to say something. So when I actually volunteered at the Eradicating Ecocide office back in 2012, just for a few weeks, but that was when I met Polly and also Zoe, who is on this call as well. When the ecocide was, it was sort of getting going as a movement, really. And I think one of the key things that stuck with me was something Jojo's also mentioned, that if business wants to have a level playing field, and as much as possible, they want to have certainty about what is going to happen. So having a law of ecocide means that everyone knows what's what, and then everybody works from that baseline. It's a bit like saying, oh, we're going to phase out fossil fuel cars by 2030. Then business knows that that's happening and they can plan for that. So, the more certainty the corporate world has, the better. So, I don't think it would be a disaster for business, as you've pointed out, Jojo. The finance sector is asking for this to be law. So, the way I see it, also, we're always going to do some harm, or are going to have some kind of impact on the earth, and it's a question of what is acceptable. But the more we as a species get clear on what is and isn't acceptable, we can course correct. But at the moment, when it's a free-for-all, there are no limits. And I really, that's the real problem we have at the moment, is there's no limits. And we see where that's got us to, and how badly we need to change course. So yes, it's a balance that needs to happen. I do believe the ecocide law could well be a way of adjusting the balance. Rachelle.
Yeah, I don't want to take up too much time, but I want to say that today economic development goes on and on and on, unlimited economic growth without any consideration of planetary boundaries, or if the environment can bear all this economic development. And it has to be the other way around. It's not that the environment is an externality to the economy, but the economy is part of the environment, it's part of nature, and it cannot grow beyond planetary boundaries. And also, economic development, I mean, there are some countries like the United States and Europe that have too much economic development, and the people who are really enjoying it are like maybe the 10% the richest people. And then you go to African countries where they don't have enough economic development. So it's a matter of equity too. Rich countries have to stop developing so that to even out the playing field, so that the countries that really do need development can do it. So I think it's a matter of distribution. There's too much economic development in the wealthy countries and not enough in other countries where the people are really suffering because of it.
Mm.
I also think there's a slight there's a sort of dichotomy embedded in the question a little bit, that opposes protection of nature with economic development, but those things don't have to be in opposition at all. They have ended up in opposition, partly because of a sort of rather deeply embedded alienation that we've got in our Western culture, towards nature. That's something that's developed over centuries. If effectively our current system is the logical conclusion of that attitude, but that attitude doesn't have to remain in place. And of course, with the right parameters, that economic activity does not have to equate with destruction of the environment or severe destruction of the environment. So, and of course, there's the aspect that Lisa brought up, which is that effectively, economic development still has to happen within criminal law parameters. I mean, you can't go to a government and say, "Can I have a license to kill 500 people for my new business?" I mean, you're just not going to do it. So once those bottom lines shift, then so will the economic activity.
Yeah. There are so many signs of how much this is needed, also from the business community. That so Valerie Cabanes, I think about her seminar many times over, actually, and where she had 1,000 executives, and then she said what Polly said, advised her to say, that with this law, it enables you to go to your boards and say, this is not acceptable, it is illegal, and if you don't like my stand in this, your new CEO will say the same. So it is actually helpful for you to do the right things. And she got standing ovations from 1,000 executives. So people want to do the right thing. And even if you are a multi-billionaire, you're also a victim of a system, and most likely not knowing that there is an idea that fixes the fundamental thing. And a last point I'll just quickly make is, there's this fantastic report written by Dasgupta and team about the economics of ecology for the British, I think, government, and it exposes how vulnerable nature is. You cannot fence it in because we are embedded in it in ways that you cannot box in. It's a subject, so the consequences doesn't hit you when you destroy things. There are several aspects they can unsurface, and when you look at it, it's a cry out for ecocide law, because you need a strong deterrent that takes us off the free fall, and business wants it. It's a relief to get it, and it's a curse not to have it if you do strategic planning in a company. I've done it myself. It's a curse not to have this law. So I'll stop there.
That's right, because if you know your competitor is going to take the cheap but destructive route, and it's going to cost you more to do the right thing, that's a really difficult call to make in a business. It might put you out of business to do the right thing, because you're no longer competitive. But if everyone is told you can't do this anymore, that's when you have the chance to make the world better, and it applies to everybody. Yeah,
you can do it in concert with it.
Yeah, so we have a few more minutes. I hope I pronounce your name right. Is it Nigar? Has asked about the Vietnam War as an ecocide, been recognized as an ecocide. Nevertheless, even in the 21st century, this ecocide continues in one form or another. But after this, the confession to this, can we see the development of any international sanctions or existing sanctions? So for the panel, would anyone like to speak on this? I think it also opens to what if we have a law of ecocide, what are would the sanctions then be?
Yeah, I think I mean, in a sense, this movement towards criminalizing ecocide is precisely a response to what Nigar's bringing up. Can we see the development of international sanctions? I mean, effectively, this, we are quite literally, developing the concept of putting something in place that can sanction those activities. In terms of the actual sanctions that, in terms of, sentencing and so on, I think we're at slightly early stages with that yet. But that said, and I realize that the French definition is not actually very close to the international one, but France did include ecocide in its climate and resilience law last year. And right now, the first ecocide trials are actually going on in France. Although, as I say, the definition that they use is rather watered down compared to the international level crime that we sort of advocate for. But what is interesting is that they have included fairly significant sanctions of, sort of a decade in jail, for example, for the severe pollution that they're using ecocide to describe.
Rachelle.
Yeah, I want to follow to what Jojo just said, because international sanctions are they're hard to obtain, because it's an international system, which means that every country has its own sovereignty, and it's very hard to work with. It's not a supranational system like in Europe. It's not international. So like United States, talking specifically about what the United States did in the Vietnam War. So the United States is not a member of the ICC, which means that it's out of boundaries. It can't be touched. But I want to echo what Jojo said, that the national level is probably the best way to go. These are like tar sands is a national crime in Canada. There should be. I mean, it's if it's legal, if it's not legal, if they are not in compliance with their permits. So why aren't NGOs out there taking them to court? I mean, or if they can't take them for criminal prosecution, so they could submit complaints to the prosecutor in Canada, to the national, or to Alberta, the provincial government or the national government. So that would be the way to do it. I don't know why it's not happening. I suspect, and I hope I'm wrong, that they're in compliance and you can't touch them. But the problem is the law and not the enforcement. But I would say, yeah, work on the national level at this stage until we get a crime of ecocide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we have 1 minute. I think I would like to round up on Elnare's comment. She says, I'm not sure if it's a reasonable thing to suggest, but I think it's a very reasonable thing to suggest, that it would be a good idea to give legal education, simple legal education, to ecological scientists, or maybe all scientists, or even you could turn it around and have education on ecology to lawyers, for example. And in fact, I would go so far in the Ecological Law and Governance Association. That's one thing we're advocating for, is that pretty much everyone who goes to school should really be learning about the interconnectedness of all things through learning about ecosystems and how they function. But yes, I think there is a huge need for more and better education on these fundamental things that show us how the world works, and how we as humans fit within the whole of life, basically. So Rachelle, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I'll do it really quickly. I want to add one more sector of our society to the group that needs ecological and environmental education, and that's judges. We need our judges to know what's going on, because I think they're going to save us. There's a governance gap, and governments aren't working. They're not taking care of us. They don't really seem, they're supposed to be taking care of us, but they're not really doing it. So, I've seen the wonderful climate litigation. I just saw that wonderful movie, Duty of Care, last night. Have you seen it yet? The climate litigation on Roger Cox's work. So I feel that the judges in this movie were just so wonderful and so understanding and knew what was going on. And we need more judges like that. So let's educate the judges. Thank you.
Thank you. Any final words from Jonas or Jojo?
It's lovely to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining.
This was very enjoyable.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah, we had fun.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone who's joined. Now, something Jonas suggested is that we have some kind of a document that links to some of the things we've been talking about. And I think once this is posted on Consensus Law's Instagram page or on their website, then we can also include some references there. In the meantime, I know that on Stop Ecocide International, you have documents as pages of resources on about ecocidal research that's been done on it and papers that have been written. And Jonas, maybe, I don't know if you have a link to your report. I think I've linked to it on the Earth Law Alliance website, where I've posted about this webinar. But here we go in the chat, if anybody wants to quickly take that, endecocide.se, and then
Rapporter.
what that's called, a slash, and then rapporte, ARPPORTER.
Yes.
So that's in the chat. But thanks everyone. Thank you Consensus Law for hosting. Sorry about the technical difficulties at the beginning. I'm glad people managed to join nevertheless. And we are hoping to have another webinar in 2 weeks' time on the 6th of December on the human right to a healthy environment. And that will be with David Boyd, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. So please join us for that. And have a good rest of the day and evening. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.